What is up, everybody? Welcome back to your favorite channel on YouTube. My name is Vihan, and as always, I'm your host here on the Sports Medicine channel. Now, today's video is very special because we've just hit 200 subscribers here on the channel. I can't thank you all enough for all of your support throughout the early part of this journey, and I can't wait to delve further into sports medicine with you as we continue onward. Now, the next part of that journey starts here today, where we are going to commemorate this 200 subscriber accomplishment by naming every single one of the 206 bones in the human body. Now, as you can see, I'm going to be helped out by Skelly the Skeleton, our good old friend over here. But before we get into naming the bones, we've got to split up the skeleton into its two main parts, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So the axial skeleton encompasses the 80 bones that are kind of in that center core of your body, in the head, the neck, the back, and the chest. All of those bones are in the axial skeleton, kind of in this general area. Then you have your appendicular skeleton, which includes all of the bones that are attached or appended to your axial skeleton. So things like the shoulder bones, all of the bones in the extremities, and your pelvis, those are all in the appendicular skeleton, and that includes the other 126 bones. And one last thing we should do before we jump right into naming the bones is to classify the 5 major types of bones. So first we have long bones, which are kind of that classic bone that you think of when you think of a bone. They have a long and thin shape, and they're present in places like the arms and the legs. Then second, and contrastingly, we have short bones, which have a squat, cubed shape, and they're present in places like the wrists and the ankles. Third, we have flat bones, which have a flat and broad shape, and those are present in like the shoulders, the ribs, the sternum, and the skull. Fourth, we have sesamoid bones. These are pretty rare across the body, but they're small bones present at the surface of joints, and they're usually embedded in muscles or tendons. A very prominent example includes the kneecaps right over here. And finally, scientists kind of grouped all the rest of the bones that didn't fall into these 4 categories into a category called irregular bones. Now, let's begin, and we'll start off with the top part of the axial skeleton right up here in the skull. The skull is made up of 22 bones, which are split into 2 categories, cranial bones and facial bones. So first, let's name the 8 cranial bones that sit at the top of the skull here, whose function is to protect the brain. These 8 cranial bones are first 1 frontal bone, then 2 parietal bones on the top, then 1 occipital bone in the back, 2 temporal bones on either side. That's 6. We need 2 more, and those 2 more are first 1 ethmoid bone, which is a very small bone at the top of the nasal cavity. It sits in between the eyes and behind the nose, so it's kind of inside your face there. And then finally, we have 1 more sphenoid bone, and that sphenoid bone starts right here in front of the temporal bone. It goes inside your face at a slant, comes right out here on the other side in front of the temporal bone, and that sphenoid bone is very important for enclosing the brain on the bottom and fixating these 8 cranial bones to the 14 facial bones, which we'll talk about in just a second. Now, along with those 8 cranial bones, we also have 14 other facial bones that make up the 22 total bones in the skull. These 14 facial bones are the 2 lacrimal bones at the bottoms of the eye socket, the 2 nasal bones right here at the top of the nasal cavity, the 2 inferior nasal conchae, which are on the sides of the nasal cavity here, 1 vomer bone, which is at the back of the nasal cavity inside of your face, 2 zygomatic bones, which are your cheekbones on either side here. Then we have the upper jaw, which is called the maxilla. It's right here, and it's actually made up of 2 bones, 1 on this side and 1 on this side, and it supports the nasal cavity and your upper teeth. And then finally, we have the lower jaw right here, called the mandible. And boom, we are done with the skull, but we are not yet done with the head and the neck. We still have 7 bones to go. We've got 3 bones in each ear, the malleus, incus, and stapes, or in their English names, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. And actually, the stapes bone, or the stirrup, is the smallest bone in your body. Isn't that cool? Yes, it is. So along with these 6 bones, 3 in each ear, of course, we've got 1 major bone in the front of your neck, which is called the hyoid, and it has a horseshoe shape. And the hyoid bone, which is located right around here, is essential for your tongue and your tongue's movement in activities such as swallowing, speaking, and breathing. Now, we do actually have 7 other bones in the neck, which are known as the cervical vertebrae, and they're in the back of your neck here. But we'll get to those in a couple minutes when we get to the vertebral column. Now we're done with the head and the neck, and we are going to move down the axial skeleton into the rib cage, which is composed of 25 bones, 1 breastbone, the sternum right here in the middle, and 24 ribs, 12 on either side. Now, if you take a close look at Skelly over here, you'll see that some ribs are different than others. We have 7 true ribs, which are the first 7 ribs of the skeleton, and they attach directly to the sternum. Then below those, we have 3 false ribs on either side. These 3 false ribs don't attach directly to the sternum, and instead attach to the 7th rib before it goes into the sternum. And then finally, we have 2 floating ribs on either side, which don't come all the way around and definitely don't attach to the sternum. And that is it for the head, the neck, and the rib cage. We are moving and zooming through this skeleton. Now, all that's left is the backbones, or the vertebral column. Since we're done with 54 bones, and there are 80 total in the axial skeleton, how many does that leave in the vertebral column? Yes, of course, 26. You can't really see it right here, but you will be able to see the vertebral column very nicely in this image right over here. So let's get into that. So you might be able to see that the vertebral column is actually split into 5 different parts. These 5 parts are the cervical vertebrae. There are 7 of them, and they stretch from the neck down here to the 12 thoracic vertebrae. And these 12 thoracic vertebrae form the back of the rib cage. Then below the 7 cervical vertebrae and the 12 thoracic vertebrae, we have 5 lumbar vertebrae at the bottom of the back, and they are extremely important for back stability. Then below the lumbar vertebrae, we have the sacrum, and the sacrum forms the back of the pelvis and strengthens and stabilizes the pelvis. Right over here, this is the pelvis, and right there is the sacrum. And then at the bottom, we have the coccyx, or the tailbone. And the coccyx is actually a vestigial piece of your body. And back in my day, when we were primates, we actually used it to help move our tail around and balance on trees. Now, if you're having trouble remembering these 5 parts of the vertebral column, you might find it helpful to remember this little ditty composed and written by kid science prodigy Brielle Milla, who first sang it on The Ellen Show. And here it is. Cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacrum, coccyx. Again, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacrum, coccyx. And just like that, we are done with the axial skeleton. 80 out of 206 bones, or just about 39% of the skeleton, is complete. And now it's time to get into the appendicular skeleton, which includes everything that we haven't discussed so far, or everything that attaches or appends to the axial skeleton. So without further ado, let's get into that. So let's begin in the appendicular skeleton with the upper extremities, which include the shoulder and the arm. Later, we'll move on to the lower extremities, including the pelvic girdle and the legs. So if you look over here at the shoulder joint of Mr. Skelly the skeleton, you can see that 3 main bones are located in that area. The first one of them is the clavicle, or the collarbone, which is this bone right here. It comes from the sternum over to the shoulder joint. And here's a fun fact. The clavicle, or the collarbone, is actually the most commonly broken bone in the human body. Behind the collarbone, we also have the scapula, or shoulder blade. It's a triangular shaped bone, and you can't see it all that well in this image because it's in the back of the body, but you can see it pretty well right over here. The scapula, or the shoulder blade, serves 2 important functions. 1, to stabilize the shoulder during movement, and 2, to attach the clavicle over to the 3rd main bone of this shoulder joint, which is the humerus, the upper arm bone. Now that we've looked at the 3 bones that comprise the shoulder and upper arm, the clavicle, scapula, and humerus, it's time to move down to the lower arm, where we'll find 29 more bones in just this area. That is crazy. And once we're done naming all 32 of the bones on this side of the upper extremities, we'll need to multiply that number by 2 to account for both arms. So moving right along to the lower arm, let's start with your forearm right here, which is comprised of 2 bones, the radius over here on your thumb side and the ulna over here on your pinky side. Have you ever used the pulse in your wrist to measure your heart rate? Well, along with the carotid arteries located here in your neck, your radial artery, which comes very close to the surface in your wrist, can be used to measure your heart rate. The radial artery comes along the biceps muscle here in your upper arm and stretches along the neck of the radius bone. Now, we can't do a fun fact about the radius without doing one about the ulna, and for that, we'll need to refer to something that's commonly called your funny bone. Now, you may already know this, but your funny bone is not a bone at all. It's actually caused by a nerve called the ulnar nerve, which stretches down the humerus through a place on the inside of the elbow here called the cubital tunnel, and then down the humerus through the cubital tunnel, across the ulna, over the wrist, and then it forks out into the ring finger and the pinky finger. And when you hit your elbow too hard in exactly the right place, you can strike your ulnar nerve, which causes that familiar tingling sensation across your arm. Now, let's finish off the upper extremities by looking at the bones of the hand, which are divided into 3 sections. These 3 sections are the carpals, these 8 bones near the wrist. Then we have 5 metacarpals, 1 in each finger and the thumb. And then we have phalanges, 3 in each finger after the metacarpals, but 2 in the thumb. So let's start off with the carpal bones, which are in this little oval or football shape right here. And here's a mnemonic that you can use to remember them in clockwise order, starting right here under the radius and moving in clockwise fashion until you get to the carpal bone that is just on top of the thumb. The mnemonic is straight line to pinky, here comes the thumb. And these 8 bones are as follows: scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, hamate, capitate, trapezoid, and trapezium. Now, if you're having trouble using the mnemonic to remember these 8 bones, don't fret, because it's actually much easier than you think. Each of these 8 carpal bones' names is derived from a common Latin root that describes its shape. For example, the lunate bone is moon-shaped, hence the Latin root lune. You also have the pisiform, which is shaped like a pea, and the triquetrum, which has 3 corners, and so on and so forth. I personally think that remembering these names by their shape is the easiest way to do so. Now, moving right along past these 8 carpal bones in the football shape near the wrist, we've got our metacarpals. There are 5 in each hand, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 in each finger and the thumb. And then past those, we've got our phalanges. 3 in each finger and 2 in the thumb. By the way, the singular for phalanges is phalanx. So on each finger, we've got a proximal phalanx right here closest to the metacarpals, then a middle or intermediate phalanx in the middle there, and then a distal phalanx on the end. And the thumb only has a proximal phalanx and a distal phalanx, no middle phalanx. So we've got 5 proximal phalanges, 4 middle phalanges, and 5 distal phalanges, coming up to a grand total of 8 plus 5 plus 14 bones in this hand. How much does that make? 27 bones in one hand alone. That is absolutely crazy. And look at that, we are done with the entirety of the upper extremities. We went through all 32 bones on this side. That means there are 64 bones total in the upper extremities of the appendicular skeleton. Now it's time to move down to the lower extremities, which include the pelvic girdle right over here and the legs. Now let's begin with the pelvis, which is this huge butterfly-shaped bone right here. And remember that the pelvis is supported in the back by the sacrum right over here. Now the pelvis is split into 2 hip bones, or coxa, using an imaginary line right here in between the loops. And these 2 hip bones are further split into 3 important parts. The ilium, this broad part over here. Then you have this loop, which is split into 2 parts. The one on the bottom here is called the ischium, and there's another one on the top here called the pubis. Now you better tune back in here because this part is going to be what you've been waiting for. Moving down from the pelvis, we come to the femur bone, or the thigh bone. And the femur is actually the strongest and the largest bone in your body. And I actually once had the pleasure of holding a femur bone from a man who had gigantism during his life. And that femur bone was absolutely huge and quite heavy. Just to give you some perspective, the femur bone is 48 centimeters long, whereas the stapes bone, the smallest bone in your body and one of the 3 bones in the ear, malleus incus stapes, that stapes bone is just 2 millimeters long. 48 centimeters, 2 millimeters. This is 240 times as long as the smallest bone in your body. That is very large. Now, as we continue to move south from the femur, we've got our kneecaps, which are a sesamoid bone known as the patella right here and here. And then below that, we've got our lower leg, which includes 2 bones, the large tibia and the smaller fibula on the outside. And now we'll move on to the last part of not only the appendicular skeleton, but of the entire skeleton that we will be discussing today, which is, of course, the feet. Now, just like in the hands, which had 54 bones total, 27 in each hand, we have 52 bones left to go in the feet, 26 in each foot. Now, another similarity that the feet have to the hands is that they are also split into 3 different parts. These 3 parts in the foot are the tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. In the hands, they were the carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Now, the metacarpals and phalanges are essentially equivalent to the metatarsals and phalanges. However, the carpals and the tarsal bones are slightly different. In the hand, the carpal bones are important for wrist mobility, whereas in the foot, the tarsal bones, right here behind the metatarsals and phalanges, are essential to stabilize the ankle and the arch of your foot. Another difference is that there are 7 tarsal bones down here, whereas there are 8 carpal bones in the hand. Now, we are focusing a little bit on the minute differences between the hands and the feet, and if you really look at the big picture, the hands and the feet are almost the same. They have the same amount of phalanges, same amount of metacarpals and metatarsals, and the carpals and the tarsals are kind of pointing towards that same idea. And that is another huge piece of evidence that points towards our evolution from other apes and primates. Because while apes and primates have hands and feet that have a very similar structure, because they use both to climb branches, grip trees, walk through heavily wooded or shrubbed forests, we as humans, as we began to walk only on land, our feet evolved to help us serve this purpose, therefore differing from our hand structure. Okay, enough of the jibber jabber. Let's get right into the last part of our skeleton today, which is going to be the foot over here. And let's begin with the tarsal bones. Remember that the tarsal bones help to stabilize the ankle and maintain the foot's arch. The only one of the tarsal bones that's not visible in skele over here is the calcaneus, or heel bone. Of course, it is visible in this image over here. So the calcaneus would be located right underneath where your heel is. Then, after the calcaneus, we have the talus, which is this bone right here, and that is the point at which the tibia and the fibula come down and attach to the ankle joint. So the talus connects the lower leg to the rest of the foot. We have in front of the talus the navicular bone, which is this trapezoid-shaped bone right here. On the left side of the navicular, this longer one is the cuboid, and then in front of the navicular and to the right of the cuboid, we have 3 cuneiform bones, which are the medial cuneiform, which is closest to the inside of the body. Then the middle one is the intermediate cuneiform, and the one on the outside, directly next to the cuboid bone, is the lateral cuneiform. So medial, intermediate, lateral. Now in front of the tarsal bones, we have essentially the same structure as we had in the hand. 5 metatarsals, 1 in each toe, just like the 5 metacarpals up here. And then 3 phalanges on each of the toes except for the big toe, which has 2 phalanges. And again, you can see that evolution from the apes. This big toe likely evolved from a structure similar to our thumb. And of course, the phalanges on the foot are named the same way as they are in the hand. You have a proximal, middle, and distal phalanx on each of these 4 toes except for the big toe, which only has a proximal and distal phalanx, with proximal being closest to the metatarsals and distal being furthest away from the metatarsals. Now we're almost done, but we cannot finish without checking our work first. Remember that we had 80 bones total in the axial skeleton, comprised of the skull, the ear bones, the neck, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. That leaves us with 126 bones left in the appendicular skeleton. Of those 126 bones, we counted 32 in each arm, meaning 64 in the upper extremities, leaving us with 62 for the lower extremities. And that is what we haven't checked. So let's check that. On one side, we have 1 hip bone, 1 femur, 1 patella, 1 tibia, and 1 fibula. That's 5, plus the 26 bones in the foot, 7 tarsals, 5 metatarsals, 14 phalanges. That makes a total of 31 bones here on one side, 62 bones total, so we are perfect. We hit that magical 206 number. Let's go. And bang, we hit 200 subscribers, so we named all 206 bones of the human skeleton. This is an amazing accomplishment, not only the hitting of 200 subscribers, thank you all so much again for all of your support, but also the naming of the 206 bones of the human body. I hope you all had a great time today. I sure did, and I hope you all learned a lot. This is Vihan and Skelly signing off. Have a great rest of your day.